Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, all wherever you are in the world. Uh, Today, the topic we are going to discuss is inevitably Ukraine and the tensions around it. India has been, under pressure from its allies, both Western as well as from Russia, to take sides. So far, India has navigated very successfully these troubled waters. But it is a topic that is generating increasing interest, particularly amongst our expert community, because the relationship between Ukraine and Europe, Russia and Europe, Ukraine and Russia was something that the Indian expert community addressed in a very broad sense without necessarily going into the nuance. And now, when this crisis has erupted, it appears that a lot of detail that is required to make an informed understanding of the situation that is developing is missing. And I'm looking forward to this eminent panel filling some of those gaps which the Indian expert community so urgently requires. So today, without much ado, let me just introduce the participants and then explain how we will proceed. We have with us Sudha David-Wilp. She is with the German Marshall Fund, has been with them since 2011, and essentially looks at Germany and the United States, the relationship between them. And of course, that is today one of the most critical relationships. And I hope Sudha will tell us what is all this brouhaha about, Germany being the weakest link, if I recall one of the headlines in Financial Times. And why is it? Because when Chancellor Scholz was in Moscow on the 15th, he seemed to make all the correct noises and say all the right words, which would put him firmly in the Western camp on how to deal with Russia. Next, of course, we have Dmitry Novikov, who is with the Higher School of Economics. Dmitry's expertise is practically in all areas, and he will try and explain to us, even if I'm a little flippant, what is the chief culprit up to? Why is it that we are in this mess today in the international world? And finally, but not the least, of course, is Dhruva Jaishankar. I'm taking the liberty of introducing him last because he's part of our extended ORF family. Although he's an independent part of that family, heads ORF's unit in the United States. But Dhruva has sort of built his expertise, and the respect for him from amongst all of us is based on his understanding of the relationship between India and the international system and how it has evolved over the past few years. And this is exactly one of those crises where India's interaction with the great powers, with not so great powers, is becoming increasingly important. Now, with that brief introduction, let me just outline how I look at this discussion going forward. I, of course, will go through the traditional way and allow each of the participants to make a 5 to 7 minute opening statement or remarks on the lines explaining some of the issues that I have already raised. After that, I, of course, will have some questions, but do feel free to participate and query each other if anyone has any questions. And although I don't want this to descend to the level of Indian television, but I would happy to see some discussion amongst you, even if you have conflicting views. So without further ado, let me ask Sudha to kick off this discussion.
Thank you so much for the invitation to join this panel. I guess I'll start with what you outlined at the beginning, namely why this is also important to a country like India, this crisis regarding Russia, and also the vantage point from Germany. Secretary Blinken paid a visit to Berlin a few weeks ago and really emphasized the urgency of the situation. And he also stressed that this conflict that involves Ukraine is more than just two countries. It involves more than just two countries, namely Russia and Ukraine, but it has ramifications for the whole international system. It touches upon principles that we've built, democracies, in the post-Cold War era, and these principles are being put to the test. So I do think that this is a topic that is not just important for Europeans and the United States and the European security architecture, but has an influence for democracies all over the world. In terms of Berlin, the new government, the traffic light government, which is comprised of three parties, the Social Democrats, the Free Democrats, and the Green Party, they got off to a slow start when it came to sort of coming to a clear position with the conflict. I think that they didn't really think about a foreign policy test in the first 6 months of this government because the coronavirus is still, playing a very large role here in German society. And they were not thinking about something as significant as war in Europe. And even the coalition agreement did really just sort of briefly touch upon this conflict in terms of saying that there would be no delivery of lethal arms to any conflict zones. So that also includes Ukraine. And the messages were just sort of mixed because of the infamous Nord Stream 2 pipeline. Chancellor Scholz in December tried to continue Merkel's rhetoric regarding the pipeline, calling it just an economic project. And I think that was sort of trying to defend the indefensible because clearly the project has geostrategic factors involved. And I think that this government has finally clarified its position. It's come out strong for the transatlantic relationship and being a part of the West. Scholz and his foreign minister, Baerbock, have been participating in shuttle diplomacy all over Europe and also have paid visits to Washington, where President Biden really went out on a limb during the press conference in the White House last week, saying that Germany is undoubtedly a reliable partner. You talked about the Wall Street Journal article that questioned whether Germany is a reliable ally to the transatlantic relationship. And the answer was 9, according to that op-ed piece. And there have also been headlines about Germany being the weakest link in the transatlantic relationship. I think that history is always going to play a role in Germany's position in terms of taking responsibility or playing a global role on this world stage. This country is very skittish about military conflict. They've increased defense spending over the years, but still have not met the 2% goal when it comes to the NATO commitment. And so Germany is going to try to help in other ways. It remains one of the largest donors to the Ukraine. It will send troops to the eastern flank and just sent an additional 350 troops to the Baltics, and will always be a cheerleader for the transatlantic relationship because it's a pillar, it's existential for Germany. And I think that it will be a solid partner, but of course, there will always be critique about its hesitation to play a larger military role. Let me stop there and let others join in, and then I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Sudha. I think, that was really brilliant, very concise and sort of encapsulation of the German perspective on this particular conflict. But sure, we will, through the discussion, come out and get more detail. With that, let me move to Dmitry. Dmitry, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thanks once again to give me an opportunity to join this panel and to speak about such an important issue. I would like to agree that, of course, Ukraine had a very clear global perspective, at least by two reasons. Because, well, first of all, just like the Crimea in 2014, it's not a story about just territory, not a story about just relations between Russia and its neighbor country, but in many respects, a story about international order and how Russia and the West understand the international order in general. And this is probably the most important fundamental contradiction between the United States, well, West in general, and Russia, because well, it all goes from the Cold War. The end of the Cold War is interpreted quite differently within the Western and Russian narrative. And Russia insists that Russia did not, was not defeated during the Cold War, that the new rules of European security should be based on some kind of realist perspective, balance of power, and the expansion of NATO and NATO-centric security system in Europe is something, well, unjust, we can say, about it. And this kind of creates this kind of narrative which actually dominated Russian foreign policy under Yeltsin administration, Putin administration, Medvedev administration. So it's not like it's a matter of person on the top, right, in the office, but it's a part of the Russian strategic culture. And here, where we can say that Ukraine and the current crisis around Ukraine is truly important, because if the West allow Russia to think that, okay, Russia could have its sphere of influence in post-Soviet space, then it means that probably China also would like to do the same, right? Maybe even India, and it's a totally different picture, totally different international order, which is very close from the liberal international order, which was established as a result of the Cold War, right? But something pretty close to the 19th century perspective, right? Or even some kind of the world of after Westphalia, something like that, with great powers, with their own spheres of influence, and so on. So, and secondly, of course, it is about behavior of other actors. And of course, in Washington and in Moscow, the governments, the diplomats pretty closely observe the Chinese policies towards Taiwan, of course, because once again, at least this idea dominates the Russian foreign policy expertise. If the West would demonstrate its weakness in Europe, then it might lead to a much more proactive, maybe even aggressive policies of China in the Asia-Pacific, what would weaken the West in general. There are pretty different kind of groups in Moscow, and some of the most aggressive kind of people in the government consider this scenario as a very positive, because decline of the West, well, they consider decline of the West as one of the kind of key aims of the Russian foreign policy. The question here, if Russia truly wants to establish some kind of sphere of influence in the post-Soviet space, and what are the true intentions of Russian foreign policy, of Russia's policies in Ukraine, of Russian escalation in Ukraine, because to some extent it seems to be, from one point of view, logical in the context which I described. From another point of view, pretty strange, because after Geneva, when Biden and Putin met and started the strategic dialogue, it seems to be that Russia got what it wanted. The dialogue about European security, the dialogue about strategic stability, the direct communication with the new US administration. And then all of a sudden in November, December, Russia initiates this kind of escalation, which is extremely risky for Russia. And it is very questionable if it is, well, makes sense, even to achieve the aims I described. So I think I will leave some kind of, well, ideas about it to the further discussion. and end up here, giving floor to other speakers.
Well, that's an interesting encapsulation of the Russian position. It has generated more questions, I think, than provided answers, but definitely it does provide the perspective that Russia wants to move towards establishing its clear-cut spheres of influence and wants recognition of that from the international community. Okay, Dhruva, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm not sure. I'm certainly not an expert on Russia and Ukraine. In fact, I rely on Nandan and others to and read them carefully to guide me on a lot of that. Nor am I the best person really to provide a U.S. perspective on this issue, although it does seem to be dominating debate and discussion over the past few months here in Washington. What I will do is, I think, a little bit just in the spirit of being somewhat provocative. I'm not going to go into the sort of right and wrong of this issue or frame it as what will happen. I don't think anybody, I certainly don't have no idea what will happen in the next few days and weeks and months. But I do think it's interesting to look at the sources of this conflict as a question of competing power systems. If one wanted to really look at this in a realistic point of view, and the thing is, in the U.S., that's not how it is often framed. It is often framed as a question of democracy and values and all of that, and that's not to dismiss that, but I do think it might be a more helpful frame of analysis. And for anybody who has read, Thucydides, there's the famous line from the Melian Dialogue, which is the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. And in some ways, that is at the heart of one can see this as at the heart of the current origins of the crisis. In some ways, the original problem was really what to do with how to organize the security of the post Warsaw Pact, the post communist bloc in the years after 1989. This is in some ways the central issue. And the negotiations in the 1990s related to German reunification really focused on the question of East Germany and whether NATO troops could be stationed there. If you see the declassified discussions between Jim Baker, the US Secretary of State at the time, Gorbachev, that was really the central focus. It was also assumed, just because of the pull factor, that Poland, Czechoslovakia, subsequently Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Hungary would also eventually join what became the European Union and NATO, and that is what happened quite soon, relatively soon after the end of the Cold War. But after that, it became more of an open question, and we saw, I think, in particular, there was an element of surprise. Certainly, it seemed from Moscow when the Baltic states, in particular, joined NATO, and there wasn't even really an intent on the part originally on the US to bring the Baltic states into NATO and on Brussels' part of the European Union. In fact, it was really the events of the late 1990s, the role of those countries in some of the in the Balkan Wars, in Afghanistan, that helped to pave the way. And particularly led by countries like Denmark, strange enough, that played a very active role in bringing the Baltic states into NATO. It further went into the Balkans, where, again, Russia, of course, had different views on the US-NATO intervention in the Balkan conflicts in the late 1990s. And eventually, after that resolved itself, the integration of Slovenia, Croatia, Montenegro, Albania, even into the Western Balkan states, into the European Union and NATO in some cases. So you essentially had a period where, despite opposition from Gorbachev, from Yeltsin, and from Putin in the early 2000s, the West in some ways had the power and the ability to integrate this region into the European Union and into NATO. Now, I would point to three quick turning points, which were 2008, the Bucharest Conference, 2012, Putin's re-election and the protests that happened, and in 2014, which was the Euromaidan protests in Kiev. It's characterized different ways, but it's essentially a change in government in Ukraine, one that was seen as more favorably disposed towards the West. And I think these three moments, you see in 2007, just a year before, Putin makes a speech at the Munich Security Conference where he lays out his opposition to, as he saw it, to what has been happening, but didn't really have the ability to do much about it, again, like Yeltsin and like Gorbachev before. But these three incidents, this 2008, the loose promise, if you will, of potential Ukrainian and Georgian incorporation into NATO, or a pathway towards that, in the 2012 election and the protests against Putin, and the 2014, what was seen as successful change in dispensation in Ukraine, were in some ways the trigger point that led to the annexation of Crimea in 2014 and the Donbass, the low-level conflict in Donbass that continues to this day. Now, that just fast forward quickly to today, and I think a question that has been raised as well is why now? Why have we seen this build up over the past several months? What is it that Russia hopes to achieve from this? I think this is an open question. It's been the subject of debate. And I'll outline three broad theories that have been circulated. Again, it's hard to verify which of these it is. It's perhaps some combination thereof. But I think it's useful to discuss this only to help us, inform us what may be the path ahead. One is, in fact, looking at it somewhat differently, which is perhaps this is the last chance that Russia has to ensure that Ukraine does not irrevocably slide into a very pro-Western camp. That is, increasingly public opinion polls show Ukrainians do want, would prefer being part of the European Union than part of a Russian customs union. There are deep divisions within Ukraine as well, between the East and West, that are reflected there between the Russian-speaking population, obviously, and the Ukrainian. But perhaps this is really the last chance for Russia to get a settlement more on its terms. A second theory is that this is really a major high-stakes bargaining chip with the US. That is pushing for a maximalist position as an effort to get some kind of diplomatic solution that may not be exactly what Russia wants, but certainly will be much more favorable than it might otherwise get. And that this is a moment in time when the Biden administration seems focused on reallocating resources to the Indo-Pacific, to focus on China, that this might be the optimal time for Russia to achieve some concessions on that score. The final sort of theory has to do largely with Russian domestic scene, and again, I'm not really well placed to comment on that. But that this really has to do more with President Putin, with the domestic agenda, and that this is sort of potentially quite popular in Russia. So. Again, it's hard to assess which of these is the primary factor, but I do think drilling into that question would help us understand how, if possible, it may be possible to de-escalate. Obviously, attempts are being made. Finally, I'll just end on one note on this, which is I see a lot of commentary on the US seeming to exaggerate the threat. But I would say, again, and I'm in no position to verify the claims one way or the other, but I can say that people at the State Department and the White House are extremely concerned about an imminent conflict. I mean, on any day. Whether or not, again, it is justified is a different matter, but there is very, very serious concern there at the highest levels. And we just saw this reflected in not just Kamala Harris's speech in Munich, but also President Biden's series of tweets yesterday, which outlined the position. And I would also add that it's not just the US, by the way. It is also NATO Secretary General. Today, Germany and Austria have announced a recommended withdrawal of citizens from Ukraine. So there is much more widespread concern beyond Washington about this. Again, whether justified or not, I will not get into. So I'll end on that note, and I do think it is a very serious and imminent situation, and getting to the heart of the problem is still a challenge.
Thank you, Dhruva. I think that very nicely sets us up for what I would consider to be a fairly lively discussion, and I hope the three of you will join it. But let me start by asking Sudha, could you in greater detail maybe explain how is this issue playing out within Germany? At the end of the day, you spoke of the new traffic light government, and obviously there are differing views, and nobody was prepared for a foreign policy challenge this quickly into their term. But at the same time, even in the run-up to the election, that Nord Stream would be an issue with the West in general, forget about Ukraine at this point, was something that was understood, despite Biden saying that, some via media would be found and all that. Ukraine, of course, has exacerbated that, if anything. But if you could just shed some light on this and on what is this, at least I keep hearing this, about this historic relationship. Some people even refer to the Rapallo Treaty and all that historic relationship between Germany and Russia. What is all this?
Thanks, Nandan. And I do want to also comment on Dhruva's question first about Germany. I talked about history when I opened up, and I guess Russia looms very large in the minds of Germans in terms of historical responsibility vis-a-vis World War II. And part of the reason Germany wants to avoid conflict with Russia is because of historical guilt. But what Germans don't sort of seem to remember is that Ukraine was also very much a victim of World War II. Many, many people died during World War II in Ukraine. And I think that there is a growing consensus here that Germans should also overcome this debate about history when it comes to playing a role in foreign policy, because helping Ukraine is also part of creating stability in Europe, and sitting on the sidelines doesn't necessarily ensure stability in Europe. So, it really boils down to the SPD party, the Social Democrats. They like to think of themselves as the party of Ostpolitik. Willy Brandt very famously extended an arm to Russia to try to keep relations and channels open with Russia during the Cold War. But I think that also is not a holistic picture today, because that also happened during the backdrop of a strong NATO, a strong West German army, and deterrence. And that link is missing today when it comes to performing Ostpolitik with Russia. If Germans only see trade as the only way of opening a good relationship with Russia. And also there is a philosophy called Wandel durch Handel, so change through trade. This is also something that I think is not the right policy today, considering what Russia has done over the last couple of years in terms of destabilizing Europe. And there's also been a change of opinion in Russia. The so-called Russia-Versteher, or sort of the sort of sympathetic view on Russia, or this understanding of Russia's history, has changed since Germany has also seen election interference coming from Russia. The government or an agency has just banned Russia Today in Germany, which caused a lot of consternation on the part of the Russian government. There was the assassination in Tiergarten in broad daylight a few years ago, and also the shooting down of the MH17 airline, which I think really changed opinion in Germany. And just going back to what Dhruva said, I think that after the fall of the wall, I don't think there was an automatic assumption that Central Europe would automatically, join the West. I think that was left open for a few years. And at the end of the day, I'm not an expert. I think Dmitry could shed more light, but Dhruva's third theory of, this sort of being, this action now is on the part of Putin to secure his stronghold in the country seems to make sense, because Ukraine and Russia and the West were part of the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, which ensured Ukrainians' territorial integrity and sovereignty in exchange for its giving up of its nuclear weapons. So I think now there's a move on Putin to look back and his playing the victim of Russia not being listened to. But, there was never an agreement in the 2+4 talks after the fall of the wall that, countries could not join the West, or that they would be off limits. And I think the West is going to stick very firmly to its open door policy at NATO.
Thank you, Sudha. I think that was very useful. In fact, just to throw this bit of information in, just today I was reading some headlines that recently declassified documents suggest that actually that Western European leaders actually thought they had made a commitment not to expand the security organizations eastwards. But I have not seen the document, so that's open.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about. There was an article in Spiegel, and I haven't read it, but this could have been also an internal memo that wasn't necessarily verified, but I'm not privy to that information either.
Yeah, no, I just saw it. I didn't have the time to go through it in greater detail. But thank you once again. I think that does explain some of the questions that at least I had. And moving on to Dmitry, of course, there are a lot of questions that both Dhruva and I think Sudha have raised about Russia and what it is seeking through all this. But I do agree with Dhruva that, it is an unusual situation, even if the argument is that our troops are within our own territory and therefore, nobody has a right to tell us where we place our troops on our territory, which is in a legal sense of a correct argument. But when you mass more than 100,000 troops on the borders with a country that does not necessarily have a good relationship with you, it is obviously open to questions. And the reason I'm asking that is, we have the similar experience. When we had the attack on the parliament in 2001, India also announced a mass mobilization, and Indian troops massed on the borders with Pakistan. And there was a lot of tension in the air. But at the end of the day, is war a real possibility? And after that, I'm going to ask you a question, or I'll ask it right away, is does Russia really want, because I can see only one beneficiary in all this, and that is China. Does Russia really want to work towards a benefit for China?
Well, thank you so much. I will try to react both to your questions and to what the previous speakers said. Well, I can put it short. The short version would be, yes, the war is possible, but nobody wants it, right? And I would say that for Russia, any even local conflict in Ukraine would be a total diplomatic defeat. That is why quite a lot of Russian experts say that the key threat would be rather some kind of provocations from Ukraine side, and it might lead to escalation. And in this case, Russian troops would have to get involved to protect the DNR and LNR, the People Republics in the eastern part of Ukraine. And in this case, you are totally right. The only side which would be beneficial would be China, because Russia would have to face drastic consequences, the economic sanctions. The Russian economy would collapse, but the Russian state, with all tanks, divisions, and so on, would survive, right? But definitely it's not, the scenario we want, actually. Basically, reacting to Dhruva's words, he tried to interpret it and came up with three theories, right? Well, first of all, as a person from Moscow, I would tell you, we don't understand what our government does, actually. I'll be honest to you, but we can come up with some ideas what is going on, right? First, Dhruva mentioned, well, three kind of concepts, right? First, it's kind of the last chance. So it's the last attempt to stop Westernization of Ukraine. But honestly, it hardly explains why today and why in this way. Because, well, last chance is always a very kind of abstract concept. In 2014 was the last chance, right? And after that, a lot of people say, well, now Ukraine is westernized and Russia lost it. Now is last chance. Maybe 10 years would be another last chance, and so on. From this perspective, westernization of Ukraine could be a permanent process, and probably the only red line is the official membership of Ukraine in NATO. Maybe not even in European Union, but European Union is also kind of is not a good scenario for Russia, right? So from this perspective, it's maybe not a good instrument to explain that things. Another concept is domestic agenda. And I would agree that to some extent it made some sense, especially after 2014, right? At that time, quite a lot of experts pointed out that Ukraine posed not a strategic threat for Russia, but rather an institutional threat, because it's so close to Russia in terms of political culture. There are so many social and personal connections between Russian families, Ukraine families. The information space is the same. And if Ukraine would become a successful democratic state, then it might pose a threat to the regime, right? Or the stability in Russia or something like that. And this explanation was pretty popular, but I would not say that today it also works, because Russian political space was pretty sterilized. Now it's very stable, right? While Ukraine, you know, Westernization or Easternization of Ukraine is only one dimension. Another dimension is successful Ukraine or failed Ukraine. And for now, in Russian society, the opinion is rather that Ukraine is not so successful. So from this point of view, how Ukraine can pose a threat to Russian domestic politics if it is not successful, it is not rich, it is not so free, and so on. Russian people consider Ukraine as some kind of, well, Russia in the 90s. Pretty chaotic, maybe a lot of freedom, but too much freedom to some extent. So I think that maybe the interpretation which is the closest to reality is Bergman. It hardly excludes two other explanations, right? But I think that if we try to interpret Russian behavior now, it is closer to reality. And if you look at the kind of even on the announcements, actions of the politicians, yes, it's clearly Bergman, right? The pressure from the West, they say that we can put sanctions on you, and Russia continues stubbornly the accumulation of forces on the borders. But one point which I would like to express is that you say that it is pretty unusual for Russia. And Dhruva also said that that's pretty unusual situation. I would like to come up with a paradox. It's pretty usual behavior for Moscow. Because if we look at the broader history, if you remember the first Berlin crisis, 1948, 1949, when Stalin also tried to stop the expansion of NATO, insisting on kind of, well, neutralization of Germany, right? He didn't want, well, at that time, NATO did not exist, right? But his idea was that Germany should be neutral, or even maybe in some of his dreams, it should be Sovietized somehow. And he didn't have any instruments to influence the West except for military escalation, at least from his point of view. And so he decided to just pressure the West in the most vulnerable point. He thought that there he can have advantage, and he lost, because after that the NATO was created. After that, well, it actually was a political defeat. Then Khrushchev did pretty the same. In 1955, he once again withdrew forces from Austria, making Austria kind of neutral. He tried to convince Konrad Adenauer to do the same, not join NATO, right? Be neutral, be happy. Adenauer joined NATO at that time. The reaction was the creation of Warsaw Pact, and once again, a radicalization of Soviet policies towards Berlin, the Second Berlin Crisis, and also Soviet Union was defeated at that time because the West, kept to be consolidated. And from this perspective, this military escalation could be considered as a not so much unusual instrument. We just came back to a similar situation in terms of strategic situation, but closer to the western borders of Russia, right? And in terms of mentality, because once again in Moscow, the leadership consider it as some kind of continuation of the previous Cold War and use pretty the same tactics to achieve pretty the same aims. Do you remember what they said in 2014, right, when there was a discussion about the future of Ukraine? Lavrov and Putin repeated several times the word Finlandization, right? So we need Ukraine to be like Finland during the Cold War. It could be a part of the Western Alliance, right? But it should be friendly to Russia, it should not be a member of NATO, something like that. So from one point of view, it demonstrates the approach. From another point of view, it demonstrates the mentality, right? They use the same terms, right, in this situation. So, and here I would like to finish, but before that, I just would like to point out another idea, which seems to be very important from my point of view, that probably I started with the idea that Russia wants to establish some kind of sphere of influence, right? So probably it is not the real Russian aim, right? I would argue that Russia tries to construct a security belt, right? And from this perspective, for Russia, it is not necessary for the countries of the post-Soviet space to be pro-Russian, at least in a sense, that if it is pro-Russian, then it is anti-Western. Look at Armenia, for instance, right? They signed the treaty with European Union, and Russia did not intervene to Armenia or did something wrong with it, right? Unlike Ukraine, when Ukraine just thought about this agreement, Russia reacted immediately, right? So from this point of view, I think that we have to interpret Russian policies in post-Soviet space as a much more complex. I think there are two basic demands of Moscow to all post-Soviet space. First of all, you should be domestically stable, because domestic destabilization of these countries are interpreted by Moscow as a threat, domestic threat of Russia, it's threat to the national security, right? And secondly, you should keep stable and good relations with Russia. You could even have good relations with the West or something like that. And the key problem is that somehow both sides just continue to understand this situation within the zero-sum game, right? I think that from this perspective, there is still a possibility for us to find some kind of consensus about it, because this is not about spheres of influence. What means that sphere of influence is always a zero-sum game, right? It means that I need to control you and everybody else not, right? But from this perspective, I think that it's a matter of Russian historic concerns about the expansion of NATO, and what is necessary is just to calm down and try to understand this kind of concerns of each other perfectly and find out a solution where Belarus, Ukraine would not pose a threat or problems to both sides. However, and I finish. However, it is just very difficult in this history, right?
No, I actually have a question. I have a question, Dmitry, because I mean, this narrative is really interesting, but I would argue that Ukraine never really had NATO on the agenda in 2014. I mean, the trigger, as you mentioned, was the EU accession talks. And that's what caused Russia to react. I mean, if you think about it, NATO actually had lost almost its purpose. It was going through an identity crisis this past decade. And now Putin has inadvertently given NATO new life. I mean, in a sense, his action has brought about this Cold War mentality again in terms of building up NATO, sending forces to the eastern flank. NATO was looking at completely different reasons to, in terms of strategic concepts, in terms of climate change and cybersecurity. It was never about reintroducing troops and moving tanks over the European continent. And now all of a sudden, we're back to that history that we thought was over in 1989.
Well, I agree to you, but here where we come with a problem. I visited several times Brussels in better times, right? And that was one world. I visit Russian Minister of Foreign Affairs, that's drastically different world. We just live in two different worlds, that's probably the problem, right? Because from the Russian point of view, the intention of NATO to expand to Ukraine, Moldavia, and Georgia was indicated in 2008 in Bucharest, right? Budapest, I'm sorry. And since then, NATO somehow
but France and Germany were never for that. I mean, there was always disunity about that topic, right? I mean, and now, again, as I mentioned, we have unity in the Western alliance because of Russia's actions.
Yes, I think that Russia, from this point of view, perfectly legitimizes the existence of NATO. And well, if you look at the neorealist theory, I think that's a very good example, right? Because that's a perfect security dilemma. When both sides consider their actions as defensive ones, right? And as a result of that, we see this kind of escalation. Because in 2014, right, for instance, well, Karaganov, my dean, wrote an article where he insisted there was some kind of plan of a very quick enlargement of NATO to Ukraine. What kind of plan, just do not ask me, but that was a very strong narrative in Moscow that, yes, we are defeated. That America just push this mechanism, and that's a kind of critical point. And I think that's what I said. We need to calm down somehow and start to talk, because truly that's not a clash of strategic opponents. That's not a clash even of civilizations. That's a clash of two different, absolutely different perceptions, right?
Okay, I want to quickly butt in, and I have a question for Dhruva, in fact, and I want to come back to Dmitry after that. But Dhruva, tell me one thing. I mean, you're in Washington, and from an Indian perspective, if the United States gets bogged down in Europe, whether it's a long, tortuous, low-level conflict, or whether it is even a long, tortuous process of trying to come to an agreement, that would mean that the attention or the strategic bandwidth you want is sort of divided between Europe and the Indo-Pacific. And that is not something that India would want. Now, what is it that is being debated in Washington itself? Because what I saw yesterday was that the Senate, which was discussing action against the Russians, came up with kind of a very weak resolution, which was more of a rebuke than anything serious. What is going on in Washington?
So, look, I think a few things. I think the consensus view is that the U.S. will not just now, but in the future, will be involved in at least three theaters in the world, which are contested. One is the Indo-Pacific, which I think the growing consensus is that's the most important theater. The second is Europe, and the third is the Middle East, what in India we call West Asia, where the US at least sees Iran as the primary challenge. Now, again, there may be some developments on that with the Iran nuclear deal negotiations underway. But I don't think the mainstream view amongst both Republicans and Democrats is it's not zero-sum. The US has to play a role in all three theaters. A crisis in Ukraine will not distract from the Indo-Pacific. There's no reallocation of military assets underway, particularly in Ukraine, where the US does not yet have a security guarantee. There's not going to be an Afghanistan type situation where the US is going to inject 100,000 troops into Europe. What I think, again, a corollary to that is there's a growing bipartisan consensus that Europe needs to play a bigger role for European security. And at least one thing I find puzzling is, at least with the Biden administration, you have perhaps one of the most Europhilic, bunch of Europhiles in positions of power, including some of Sudha and my former colleagues and former bosses, Assistant Secretary of State for Europe right now. But the Tony Blinken is a complete Francophile. I mean, you run down the list. This is and they may not be, no matter what happens in the next few elections, it's unlikely you're going to have as sympathetic a group of people in charge of Washington to European concerns. So I find it confounding a little bit that particularly France, with the exception of the UK, which is in some ways playing that role, France and Germany in particular and Brussels are not taking more advantage of this window of opportunity to get a sort of a more favorable terms locked in, so that basically lean into the US relationship now, so that it helps Europe with its own security in the future. But that's related, but a slight tangent. But I think from, again, Washington point of view, I think there's not a sense that there is a minority view among some people, particularly amongst Trumps. To give an example, Elbridge Colby, who is a former Trump administration official who's written a book, who believes that Europe is going to be a distraction. The US is better off just sort of letting Europe, giving up Europe to its self, let the Europeans take care of their own security. They can afford it. The US needs to concentrate on the Indo-Pacific, and that budgetary constraints will play a factor in the long run. So now may as well cut your losses now. That's still very much a minority view. And I don't see that even in the event of a re-election of Trump or a Trump-like administration, that fully coming, again, there may be the Republicans may ask not so nicely the Europeans to burden share compared to Obama or Biden, but I think there is that growing view that Europe could be playing a bigger role for its own security. But the long and short of it is, from an Indian point of view, I don't see this as zero sum. There are no immediate plans to sort of be distracted. There actually are concerns about China doing something specifically with Taiwan in the event of an outbreak of hostilities in Europe. So but I don't see this being zero sum, at least for now.
Thank you. I mean, that's actually quite reassuring that the United States views itself, because there was a doubt about that, but it views itself as capable of being engaged with these three fronts, of being able to contribute positively to them, and particularly the factor that none of this is going to dilute its focus on the Indo-Pacific, which is what is of interest to people like me, at least from an Indian foreign policy point of view. Dmitry, before I ask for the last round from each one of you, I have a small question. Dhruva spoke about the last chance. You said that, what is this last chance and all that stuff. But at the same time, you spoke about how Russia, Soviet Union, and Russia, massing troops has always resulted in the opposition getting more united, so resulting in political defeats. What is the difference this time? Again, you've massed troops. If you know your history, this seems to be a loser's road. Why are you going down this road?
You ask me a question which is very difficult to answer, right? Well, there could be three interpretations. The first one is that it is a process which do not have any sense. And sometimes from Moscow, it seems to be like that. The foreign policy system of Russia continues to work. It have a problem, right? And when a bureaucracy and political leaders see a problem, right, they usually try to solve it, and try to solve it with very different instruments. It's a very philosophical view. Sometimes you think that only this can explain what is happening, because it's pretty crazy, right? However, if we move to some kind of interpretations which are closer to the Earth phase, right? Well, I think that Russia, from Russian point of view, the moment is pretty good, right? And we have a very important advantage for now. Because unlike during the Cold War, when the Soviet Union was imminent enemy, and the idea of the West was to contain Soviet Union and somehow deal with this threat, eliminate the threat, right? Because you always, if you see a threat, you always try to, well, finally eliminate it because you want to feel safe. This time, the situation is drastically different. So there are two factors. The first one, from Russian point of view, West is declining. The United States of America are declining, right? And this is kind of a good moment. Same could serve as an interpretation for 2014 crisis. That the Obama administration is weak to some extent. There is some kind of domestic problems in America, and they got even stronger. The European Union is not as strong as it used to be 20 years ago. And here we have a chance to restructure the whole international order and to restructure the regional security architecture as a part of this international order. Russia insisted on reform of European security since the very end of the Cold War. In the 90s, Russia tried to propose to build the European security around the OSCE, right? Make it OSCE centered. Then Russia tried to kind of even join NATO. If you remember, there was an interview of Putin in 2000 when a BBC interview asked him, would you like to join? Is it possible for Russia to join NATO? And Putin answered, well, probably that's possible, but there are conditions. Then some kind of difference, a formula was found, the Russian NATO Council, and Russian NATO Council was considered by Moscow as a decision-making forum where Russia should take part in all consultations of NATO. But then it appeared that it is just a forum for some kind of dialogue, very limited dialogue with Russia, and Atlantic Council continued to play a central role in NATO. And then the NATO summit of 2008, right, caused the first military crisis, the Russia-Georgian war. And since that, that's not the first time when Russia, with help of war, tries to launch some kind of dialogue with the West. And it seems that Russia was limitedly but successful, because after Russia-Georgian war, there was a Corfu process, right? Then after Ukraine, there was a Normandy, the Normandy war, right? Between Germany, Ukraine, France, and Russia. And Russia tried to insist on some kind of dialogue with the United States of America. For some years, it was not possible because the administration was very weak. Last years of Obama, and then 4 years of Trump. But now it's Biden, it's mainstream, it's pretty strong. Domestically, at least it's possible for him to implement something. And there we started our new dialogue with the West. So, but in long-term perspective, of course, it's very risky, and it might cause unpredictable negative consequences for Russia. Because once again, if we remember the Soviet time, in the 70s, the Soviet Union and the West were able to find a consensus about European security within the Helsinki Accords. But in several years, the Soviet Union collapsed, and all these efforts just were useless, absolutely useless. Same comes here. Russia insists on something, but as a result of that, what we have consolidation of the West, right? Weakening of Russian economy, of course, because of the risk and so on. And yes, tactically, we can achieve negotiations, and probably we can achieve some results, right? However, in long-range perspective, it might cause a lot of problems for Russia and even for Russian security. And I think that Russian government should be very careful about it. So that's my point. Maybe that's not an answer, but kind of an attempt to explain what I think.
Thank you, Dmitry. Thank you very much. And now we are coming to the end of our literal end, but I want to do one thing. I want each one of you in literally 1 minute, tell me whether you think there will be a solution or are we really staring at war? Let us start with Dmitry. Since you were speaking, you might as well go first.
It definitely will be a solution because there is always a solution. I think that there might be some kind of two solutions. The first solution is to stabilize the situation for now, and it could be found here and now. And then it should be a very long, productive, and fair dialogue, first of all, within the expertise about what to do in long-range perspective and how to make our relations normal again, because for now, I think that relations between Russia and the West are pretty far from normality.
Okay, Sudha, you go next.
Okay, I will take a gray zone answer and say there already is war in the region. You know, people are dying every day in Ukraine. The question is, will it get more kinetic? Will it escalate? And I don't know. I hope there's a solution diplomatically that we will not let the situation get out of hand. I guess I will end on saying that, also harking back to what Dhruva said, I think the debate about strategic autonomy for Europe has been put to bed for a little while. Chancellor Scholz said during his visit to Washington last week that the transatlantic relationship is key to stability in Europe. And I think this conflict with Russia shows that the United States sort of has to take a leading position when it comes to dealing with this conflict. And now the question is whether Germany will be the de facto leader, shoulder to shoulder with the United States. Secretary Blinken called Germany the partner of first resort. Now let's see what happens if there is further incursion and how Germany will respond.
I still want an answer. Do you think we are closer to a solution or we are closer to war? What is your gut reaction?
Well, I mean, right now the stakes are quite high. We're closer to war than we are to a solution, unfortunately. But I think we should never close the door on diplomacy.
Dhruva, final word is yours.
So I don't know. I'll give you two reasons for optimism and two reasons for pessimism. The reasons for optimism is that this has now lingered. This crisis has lingered now for a few months. There's no element of surprise. That means diplomacy in some ways is still on the table. That's one cause for optimism. Two, I think quite rationally, the cost for both, all the actors directly involved is very high, including for Russia, and everyone knows that. And so it'll be a lose-lose all around if this escalates significantly. So that's I hope then that there should be some diplomatic solution. On the other hand, I think there is no off-ramp in sight as of now, which is, there has been this offers going back and forth, but nothing that seems acceptable to both sides. And the part that really would keep me up at night is that the costs of a small incursion or small escalation and the costs of going all in for Russia are the same. So if I was in Moscow and I made a decision, I would not say sort of let's just gradually move into a small it would be go all in, and that would mean major conflict on a scale that you haven't seen in Europe, at least since the Balkan Wars. Versus the economic consequences will be the same either way, and that is some grounds for pessimism. We've been saying this for some time, but it could be that the next few days will be quite critical. And I just don't know what a face-saving solution at this point would look like. Hopefully something can be managed.
Well, I think you've summed it up reasonably well. We are literally at the cusp of something monumental, definitely, whether it is peace or war, but something has to give. But I thank all of you for this very insightful and I think fairly lively discussion. And I'm sure our viewers will definitely benefit from it. We've unfortunately run out of time, so I won't go through the usual chairs summing up and all that. But thank you very much for participating. And I do hope we get a chance to meet again and have this, and hopefully in person. Thank you.